It was one of those quiet, calm mornings at the Los Angeles airport when people moved in slow, sleepy rhythms. The sky outside was a soft blue, the kind that promised a peaceful flight. Inside the terminal, travelers rushed past each other, some juggling coffee cups, others dragging tired suitcases behind them. Among them was a man dressed simply: jeans, a black t-shirt, a worn-out baseball cap, and a faded backpack slung over one shoulder. Nothing about him screamed celebrity. In fact, most people who passed him didn't look twice. He stood in line like everyone else, holding his boarding pass, looking down at his phone occasionally. He wasn't wearing fancy clothes or expensive jewelry. He looked like an ordinary traveler, maybe someone flying for work or visiting family. But this man wasn't ordinary. Under that simple cap and calm smile was Keanu Reeves, the famous actor known all over the world. Yet here, in the middle of a busy airport, he was just another face in the crowd. When the flight to New York was called, passengers began boarding in groups. People shuffled forward, some eager to settle into their seats, others already complaining about overhead space. The man in the cap waited patiently, not pushing ahead, not acting like someone important. He even let a couple with a baby board before him, giving them a small nod and a kind smile. Once it was his turn, he handed his ticket to the attendant at the gate. She scanned it and looked up, her eyes widening slightly. Recognition flickered for a split second, but he gave her a small shake of the head, like asking her not to make a fuss. She smiled knowingly and whispered, "Have a good flight, sir." He thanked her quietly and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was half full. A few business travelers were already typing on laptops, and one older woman was flipping through a magazine. Keanu moved down the aisle, looking for his seat. He kept his sunglasses on, not to hide, but simply to feel like any other traveler who just wanted a peaceful flight. As he lifted his duffel bag into the overhead compartment, a man sitting in the second row glanced up. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dressed sharply in a gray suit, scrolling through his phone with an air of importance. When he saw Keanu standing there, he frowned. Maybe he thought the man looked too casual for first class. Maybe it was just one of those moments when people jump to conclusions without thinking. "Hey, excuse me," the man said loudly, pulling out one of his earbuds. "You might be in the wrong section. Economy's back that way." The words hung in the air for a second, louder than they should have been. The people nearby stopped talking. The flight attendant walking by froze for a brief moment, unsure how to respond. Keanu turned his head slightly, his sunglasses reflecting the soft cabin lights. For a second, he didn't say anything. He looked at the man calmly, no trace of annoyance in his face. "Oh," he said finally, his voice quiet and polite. "I think this is my seat." The man in the suit scoffed a little. "Are you sure?" "This is first class." Keanu gave a small smile. "Yeah, I'm sure. But thank you." He said it gently, with no sarcasm, no frustration. He just wanted to sit down. The flight attendant quickly stepped forward, sensing the tension. "Everything's fine, sir," she said to the man in the suit, her tone firm but professional. "Mr. Reeves is in the correct seat." That name, Reeves, landed softly in the air, but it was enough to cause a ripple. A young woman 2 rows behind suddenly looked up from her book, her mouth forming a silent gasp. Another passenger nudged his friend. A quiet murmur spread across the cabin as realization dawned. The man in the suit blinked, his face tightening with confusion. He looked at Keanu again, this time really looking. The jawline, the gentle expression, it all clicked. His eyes widened. Oh my God," he stammered. "I didn't realize. I'm so sorry. I thought—" Keanu just smiled again, still calm. "No worries, man," he said softly. "It happens." Then, as if to ease the man's embarrassment, he added, "You probably saved me from sitting in the wrong row." "Appreciate that." A few passengers chuckled quietly. The mood in the cabin lightened instantly. The man in the suit, his face now red with embarrassment, muttered another apology and went back to pretending to check his phone. Keanu sat down, placing his duffel bag gently under the seat in front of him. He leaned back and took off his sunglasses. His eyes were kind, calm. There was no sign of irritation or pride. Just a quiet man who happened to be recognized too often. As the flight attendants finished the pre-boarding routine, a few people sneaked glances at him. Some tried not to stare, others couldn't help but smile. There was something disarming about him, not because he was famous, but because he carried himself with a kind of peace that felt rare. Across the aisle, an older woman whispered to her husband, "He seems so normal." Her husband nodded. "He is," she said, almost as if she was reminding herself that kindness doesn't need attention. Keanu took out a paperback book from his bag and started reading. No phone, no noise, no headphones, just quiet reading. The man who had yelled earlier glanced over once or twice, maybe wondering how someone could be that patient after being embarrassed in front of a crowd. When the captain announced the takeoff, Keanu looked out the window, watching the runway roll past. The engines roared softly, the plane lifted, and the clouds swallowed the city below. For a while, everything was peaceful again. The tension from before faded away completely. The passengers around him returned to their conversations. A few took pictures of the clouds, and one child giggled as she pressed her nose against the window. About an hour into the flight, the same man in the suit leaned over slightly, his voice low. "Hey, I really didn't mean to be rude earlier. I honestly didn't recognize you. You just looked like, well, a regular guy." Keanu looked up from his book, smiling gently. "That's okay," he said. "That's kind of the goal." The man laughed nervously. "You travel alone? No assistance or anything?" "Yeah," Keanu said with a shrug. "It's quieter that way. Easier to just be." The man nodded slowly, maybe realizing that fame didn't have to come with noise or ego. For the rest of the flight, he stayed quiet, occasionally glancing at Keanu as if still processing what had happened. Later, when the meal service came around, Keanu waited until everyone in his row had been served before taking his tray. When an elderly woman across the aisle dropped her fork, he bent down immediately and picked it up, handing it back with a smile. "Here you go." She thanked him warmly, clearly surprised by his kindness. The flight attendants noticed too. One whispered to another, "He's really that nice in real life." The other smiled. "Looks like it." By the time the lights dimmed and most passengers settled into quiet, the earlier moment felt like a distant memory. But for the people who had seen it happen, the mistaken scolding, the calm reaction, it left an impression that wouldn't fade soon. The man in the suit who had started the whole thing leaned back in his seat, shaking his head slightly. He couldn't stop thinking about how easily he had judged someone. In his world, appearances mattered, suits, watches, status. But sitting next to a man who had all the fame in the world and still chose humility made him rethink what important really meant. Meanwhile, Keanu kept reading quietly, sometimes gazing out the window at the moonlit clouds. To anyone watching, he looked completely at peace, like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. No one else said, "Go back to economy" after that. In fact, no one said much at all. But a quiet respect filled the cabin, a kind of unspoken gratitude for witnessing a rare moment of grace. By the time the plane began its descent into New York, people were still thinking about it. The flight attendant smiled a little more warmly when they passed Keanu's seat. The man in the suit seemed quieter, humbler, and a few passengers already knew that when they landed, they'd have a story to tell, not about a movie star, but about a man who reminded them what kindness looked like at 30,000 feet. As the flight continued, the plane drifted higher into the sky, cutting through the clouds as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The passengers around Keanu had mostly settled into their routines, some typing away on laptops, others listening to music or flipping through magazines. But there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere since the earlier exchange. The tension had dissolved, but it had been replaced by an unspoken awareness. The man in the suit, who had earlier scolded Keanu for being in the wrong section, now sat quietly, his eyes occasionally darting over at the actor. It wasn't that he was staring, but every now and then his gaze would land on Keanu, like he was trying to figure something out. Maybe it was the kindness in Keanu's response that had thrown him off, or maybe it was just the realization that he had misunderstood the entire situation. Either way, the man was deep in thought, and he didn't seem to have much to say after his earlier mistake. Keanu, for his part, had gone back to reading his book, completely unbothered. He seemed lost in the world of the story, turning pages slowly, savoring each one. His calm demeanor was so natural that it felt as though the chaos of everyday life just didn't reach him. The other passengers around him, though, were subtly affected by it. They weren't used to seeing someone so famous and yet so normal. One woman across the aisle had her phone out, and though she tried to be discreet, It was clear she was trying to snap a picture of Keanu. She wasn't doing it because she wanted a souvenir of a movie star. She was doing it because she was amazed by how down-to-earth he seemed. Her eyes kept darting between her phone and him, unsure of how to capture the moment. After a few failed attempts, she put the phone down, as if realizing that a picture wouldn't do the experience justice. The quiet grace of the moment couldn't be captured in a selfie. The flight attendants, too, had started to treat Keanu like any other passenger, polite, but with a hint of familiarity that came with knowing they had someone special on board. One of them, a young woman with short hair, approached Keanu during the beverage service. She smiled warmly as she asked if he wanted something to drink. He looked up from his book, nodded, and ordered a simple water. As she walked away, she couldn't help but whisper to the other attendants, "He's just so normal. I thought he'd be different." The others nodded in agreement, sharing a quiet laugh. It was rare, after all, to meet a celebrity who didn't demand attention or act like they were above anyone else. Meanwhile, Keanu seemed completely at ease, as though being famous was just a small part of who he was, not the thing that defined him. His presence was unassuming and his behavior didn't scream for attention. To him, this flight was just another trip, another routine just like everyone else's. As the flight went on, the man in the suit seemed to be wrestling with his own thoughts. Every so often, he would glance back over at Keanu, his face full of contemplation. Finally, after about an hour, he leaned over awkwardly. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet but genuine. "I just wanted to apologize again for earlier. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to. Well, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Keanu looked up from his book and gave him a soft smile. "It's fine, really. I wasn't bothered by it." The man shifted in his seat, clearly still feeling embarrassed. "It's just, I don't know. I've never seen someone famous just act so normal. I mean, you didn't make a big deal about it. You didn't get angry or anything." Keanu chuckled lightly. "Anger doesn't really help, does it?" His eyes were warm, his tone kind. He wasn't making the man feel worse. In fact, it seemed like he was trying to make him feel better. The man in the suit smiled, though it was still tinged with a little guilt. "You're right. I've been around a lot of people who always expect special treatment, and I guess I assume that's how it would be." "Not everyone is like that," Keanu said, almost like he was talking to himself. "And really, there's no need for anyone to be." The man nodded slowly, taking in Keanu's words. He was still adjusting to the idea that a movie star, someone with millions of fans, someone who had seen and done things most people only dreamed of, could be so humble, so grounded. It made him question a lot of things. A few rows behind, another passenger, an older woman, watched the exchange between the two men. She was an avid reader and had been quietly observing the situation for a while. Her name was Barbara, and she was one of those people who preferred to keep to herself. But she couldn't help but notice how different Keanu was from most of the people she had met in her life. She remembered the first time she saw him on screen, years ago, in one of his action movies. At the time, she had thought of him as just another Hollywood action star. But now, seeing him in person, seeing how kind and genuine he was, made her think twice about the way she had perceived him. Barbara thought back to the time when she had met other celebrities. They were always surrounded by people, assistants, bodyguards, agents, making sure they were always in the spotlight. But Keanu wasn't like that. He was just a man trying to get from point A to point B, just like the rest of them. As the flight continued, Barbara found herself reflecting on her own life. She had always been careful not to get too close to others, keeping a bit of distance. But seeing someone like Keanu, someone who had every reason to be distant yet chose to be kind and humble, made her rethink her own approach to people. Maybe she had been too quick to judge others, too quick to hide behind her own walls. The flight attendants continued their rounds, but they made sure to give Keanu a little extra attention. They were polite, but there was something in their demeanor that showed respect, not just for him as a celebrity, but for him as a person. He had done nothing to demand it. He wasn't asking for anything. Barbara, still sitting across the aisle, noticed that one of the flight attendants, a young woman with bright eyes, came by and gave Keanu a drink, then took a few steps back, her face glowing with admiration. Barbara smiled to herself, thinking about how rare it was to see such genuine respect between people. As the plane cruised through the sky, The man in the suit finally seemed to come to some sort of realization. He had spent so much time focused on his own world, on his own success, that he had missed something important, the power of kindness. "I have to admit," he said quietly, turning back to Keanu, "I've learned something today." Keanu raised an eyebrow, curious but still relaxed. "What's that?" "The way you handled everything today. It's made me realize that maybe I need to stop thinking so much about myself and start thinking about others a bit more." Keanu's smile was gentle. "That's the best kind of learning." For the rest of the flight, the conversation between the two of them grew more comfortable. The man in the suit, who had earlier made the mistake of judging Keanu, now found himself talking openly about his life, about his work, and about his own struggles. Keanu listened patiently, offering only quiet words of encouragement when needed. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't try to fix anything. He just listened, and sometimes that was enough. When the flight began its descent into New York, the mood in the cabin had shifted entirely. What had started as an awkward confrontation had transformed into something much deeper. The passengers around them, who had been watching quietly, began to feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't about the celebrity, the fame, or the movies. It was about something far more human. It was about the way we treat each other, the way we connect, and the way we choose to be. As the plane touched down, the sound of the wheels meeting the runway signaled the end of the flight. But for the people who had witnessed the exchange between Keanu and the man in the suit, the real journey had just begun. The plane touched down in New York with a soft jolt. The passengers braced for the landing, feeling the slight tension in the air as the wheels met the runway. For a moment, the cabin was silent, only the hum of the engines filling the space. Then, as the plane taxied toward the gate, the low murmur of voices began to rise again. People were pulling out their phones, gathering their things and chatting in small groups, eager to get off the plane. For most passengers, this was just another flight, a few hours in the sky, a few moments of interaction with strangers. But for some, like the man in the suit, it felt like something more. He sat quietly looking out the window, lost in his own thoughts. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about the events of the flight. He hadn't expected to walk away from this experience with a changed perspective. But there it was. As the seatbelt sign blinked off and passengers began standing, he found himself hesitating. He glanced over at Keanu, who was calmly gathering his things, his movements slow and deliberate. There was something about the way Keanu carried himself that made him stand out in the sea of hurried people. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't acting like the rest of them, who were all trying to get to the gate before anyone else. Instead, Keanu moved in a way that seemed completely unbothered by the rush around him. The man in the suit took a deep breath and decided to do something he hadn't planned on. He stood up, grabbed his bag, and made his way over to Keanu's seat. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to make a scene. Keanu looked up from his bag, his eyes kind and unruffled. "Hey," Keanu responded, offering the kind of smile that made the man feel instantly at ease. "I just wanted to say thanks," the man continued. "Thanks for handling everything so, well, gracefully. I didn't expect that, honestly." Keanu gave a small shrug as if to say it was no big deal. "It's all good. People make mistakes." The man nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "Yeah, I think I've made a few of my own today." Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he gave the man a moment to collect his thoughts. He didn't rush him, didn't push him to say more than he was ready to. It was one of those quiet moments where just being present seemed like enough. Finally, the man spoke again, this time with a bit more honesty. "You know, I've been so caught up in my own world for a long time. I work a lot, keep to myself, but it's like, I don't know. I saw you today and it was like seeing something I hadn't seen before. I mean, you're famous. You could be surrounded by people living in some bubble, but you're not. You're just normal, like you don't let any of it get to you." Keanu listened quietly, not interrupting. It wasn't the first time someone had said something like that to him, but it didn't make it any less meaningful. "I guess I never really thought about it that way," Keanu said after a moment. "I've always just tried to do my best, be kind, you know. What else is there?" The man smiled faintly, feeling something shift inside him. "I think I've been doing it all wrong." Keanu chuckled softly. "It's never too late to change." The man felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The pressure he had placed on himself to be perfect, to always get it right, seemed less important now. Keanu's simple words had a way of putting things into perspective. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about being kind, about being real. As the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign turned off, the passengers began to gather their belongings. The man in the suit hesitated for a moment, then offered a genuine handshake to Keanu. "It was really good talking to you. Thanks for, well, everything." Keanu took the handshake, nodding. "No problem. Safe travels." The man smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and realization. It wasn't just the celebrity encounter that had left an impression. It was the human connection. The reminder that the most important things in life weren't about status or success, but about how we treated each other. As they left the plane, the crowd of passengers surged toward the jet bridge. The man in the suit found himself walking a few steps behind Keanu, not sure whether to approach him again or just let him be. But as they neared the gate, he saw Keanu glance back at him, his eyes warm, and he offered a small wave. The man waved back, a silent acknowledgement of the moment they had shared. It felt like a quiet understanding had been reached between them, even without many words. By the time the man reached the baggage claim, he felt lighter. There was a sense of clarity that had come out of nowhere. He had arrived at the airport that morning thinking it was just another day, just another flight. But somewhere between the air and the conversations that had taken place, something inside him had shifted. He didn't need to rush to prove himself to anyone. He didn't need to hide behind his work or his success. The most important thing was to treat others with respect, to be kind without expecting anything in return. As he stood there waiting for his bag, his phone buzzed. He glanced down and saw a text from his assistant, reminding him of a meeting he had scheduled for later that afternoon. Normally, he would have jumped right into work mode, getting ready to go over notes, review presentations, and brace himself for the pressure of it all. But today, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could take a breath. He didn't need to dive straight into the next task. Instead, he put the phone down and took a moment to just be present. The world could wait a few minutes. A few feet away, Keanu was waiting for his own luggage, chatting quietly with one of the airport attendants. He didn't seem bothered by the hustle and bustle of the airport. He wasn't surrounded by cameras or fans. It was just him, calmly standing in line like anyone else. The man watched him for a moment longer, then turned his attention back to his own bag as it came around the carousel. But as he grabbed his suitcase, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. The encounter had left him with a new perspective on life. As he left the airport and stepped into the cool New York air, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It wasn't a grand, life-changing moment, but it was enough. Sometimes the smallest moments made the biggest impact. He thought about how he might treat the people in his life differently now. Maybe he wouldn't be so quick to judge. Maybe he would take more time to listen. It wasn't about trying to be perfect. It was about being more human. And for the first time in a while, he was okay with that. The weeks passed quickly, and the memory of that flight, the conversations, and the lessons learned started to fade into the routine of everyday life. The man who had once been so focused on his own image, his own work, began to feel the subtle shift in how he approached the world around him. He found himself looking at people a little differently, listening more intently and thinking less about what others might think of him. There was a calmness that came with it, a peace he hadn't expected. He had also started to realize that some of the habits he had fallen into weren't serving him well anymore. The endless meetings, the rush, the obsession with always being in control, it had started to feel exhausting. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had become disconnected from the things that mattered most. The simple moments, the relationships, and the small acts of kindness that had once brought him joy. At first, it was just little things. He began taking the time to stop and chat with people in his office who he usually rushed past. He noticed how much he had missed out on by always being too busy. One morning, he spent a few extra minutes talking to a colleague who he hadn't spoken to in years. It wasn't a deep conversation, just a catch-up about life, but it felt good to reconnect with someone he had once respected, but had lost touch with in the chaos of work. There were moments, too, when he would remember what Keanu had said during their brief exchange on the plane: "People make mistakes." The words were simple, but they had stayed with him. He had realized how often he judged others too quickly, how often he had been too hard on people who were just doing their best. It wasn't that he didn't have standards, but he had started to soften a little, to give people the benefit of the doubt. One afternoon, a couple of weeks after that flight, he was standing in line at a coffee shop waiting to order. The line was longer than usual, and the person at the front of the line was taking a while to decide what to get. Normally, this would have irritated him. He would have mentally grumbled, checking his watch, wishing the person would hurry up. But this time something inside him clicked. Instead of focusing on the annoyance, he noticed the woman at the front of the line was asking the barista for advice, trying to make the right choice. She seemed genuinely interested in getting the right drink, and it wasn't that she was trying to hold up the line. It was that she was giving the process the attention it deserved. He found himself smiling, watching the exchange with a different perspective. It wasn't about impatience. It was about understanding that everyone had their own pace, their own process. Some people rushed through things and others took their time. It was okay. In that moment, he wasn't bothered by the delay. He was just there, present. When it was his turn to order, he gave the barista a genuine smile. "I'll have the same as her," he said, nodding toward the woman ahead of him. The barista gave him a surprised look, but then she smiled too. As he walked out of the coffee shop, holding his cup of coffee, he realized how much he had changed in such a short amount of time. The old version of himself would have seen that line as a frustrating obstacle. But now he saw it as an opportunity to slow down, to be present, to connect, even if it was just with a stranger in a coffee shop. The next day, he found himself walking into the office, and as he passed by the usual group of people gathered around the coffee machine, he stopped to join them. They were talking about an upcoming project, but the conversation soon shifted to something lighter. One of the team members mentioned a recent trip, and the group began to chat about travel experiences. For a moment, he felt like an outsider. He hadn't been part of conversations like this in a long time. It was always about business, meetings, deadlines, presentations. But now something felt different. He found himself laughing, adding his own stories, engaging in a way that he hadn't in years. He wasn't worried about what was next or whether he was saying the right thing. He was just there in the moment. Later that week, as he walked out of the building at the end of the day, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a close friend. They hadn't spoken in a while, and the message simply said, "We should catch up soon." The man hesitated for a moment. He could feel the familiar pull to keep busy, to avoid making time for anything that wasn't work-related. But something inside him said no. He tapped out a quick reply, "I'd love that. Let's set something up." It was a small decision, but it felt significant. For the first time in a long time, he was prioritizing the people in his life, the relationships that mattered. It was easy to get caught up in the rush, in the need to always be moving forward. But he was starting to realize that moving forward didn't always mean chasing the next goal. Sometimes it meant slowing down and savoring what was already in front of him. The next few days felt lighter. He had coffee with an old friend, spent more time with his family, and even took a day off to just relax. It was a change, but it was a good one. The stress he had once felt seemed to dissipate. He wasn't chasing after success as relentlessly as he had before. Instead, he was finding success in the small moments. Moments that had once seemed insignificant, like enjoying a quiet afternoon or having a genuine conversation with someone. A few weeks after the flight, he found himself at a business dinner, seated across from a few colleagues. The conversation turned to the topic of work-life balance, and as people began discussing their own struggles to find time for anything other than work, the man found himself speaking up. "I've been thinking a lot about that," he said, his voice calm but sure. "It's easy to get caught up in the daily grind, but lately, I've realized that sometimes the best way to be productive is to actually step back, to focus on the people around you, to take a break, to just be present. I think we all need to do that more." There was a moment of silence at the table as everyone took in his words. Then, one by one, his colleagues nodded in agreement. It wasn't a new concept, but it felt like a new perspective. Later that evening, as he walked back to his hotel after the dinner, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. It was a quiet kind of happiness, the kind that didn't rely on achievements or external validation. It was about being content with who he was and where he was in life. As he passed through the lobby of his hotel, He saw a familiar face. It was one of the hotel staff, someone he had interacted with a few times before. The man gave him a polite smile as he passed, and the man in the suit stopped for a moment. "Thank you," he said almost without thinking. "You've always been so kind to me, and I appreciate it." The hotel worker looked up in surprise, clearly taken aback by the compliment. "You're welcome, sir. It's my pleasure." The man smiled, then turned and continued on his way. He didn't know why he had said it. It was a small thing, but it felt important. Maybe it was just another reminder that kindness, however small, could make all the difference. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought back to the flight, to the moment he had shared with Keanu, to the simple yet profound lesson that had started to change his life. He had once thought that success meant constantly pushing forward, always moving, always striving. But now he understood that true success wasn't just about what you achieved. It was about how you made others feel, how you treated people, and how you took care of yourself along the way. It had taken him a while to understand that, but he was glad he had finally gotten there. And maybe, just maybe, it had all started with one simple interaction on a plane. A few months had passed since that flight. The man who had once been so immersed in his work, in the rush of life, had found a new rhythm. The change hadn't been sudden and it hadn't been easy, but it had been real. He was no longer living for the next meeting or the next big project. Now he was living for the moments in between, those small moments that connected him to the world around him. He hadn't expected to feel this way. When he first stepped off that plane in New York, he thought it would be just another fleeting experience, something that would fade into the background of his busy life. But the lessons he had learned, the importance of kindness, of being present, of slowing down, had stayed with him, and they had continued to shape his days in subtle, meaningful ways. There were still challenges, of course. He wasn't perfect and life wasn't perfect, but he had learned that it didn't have to be. He didn't need to chase after an idealized version of success. What mattered most was the people he interacted with, the connections he made, and the way he showed up in the world. One Friday evening, he found himself sitting at a local cafe, waiting for a friend he hadn't seen in a while. It was a casual catch-up, nothing formal, but it felt different. The cafe was cozy, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. He had intentionally arrived early, taking the time to sit and reflect, something he hadn't done in a long time. He thought about how much had changed in the past few months. His work had slowed down, but it hadn't suffered. If anything, he had become more focused, more present during meetings, and more patient with his team. He had stopped checking his phone constantly, no longer feeling the need to be available every second. And when he wasn't working, he was spending more time with the people who mattered most, his family, his friends, and even strangers who crossed his path in small, meaningful ways. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a colleague. Normally, he would have been quick to reply, to dive back into work mode, but today he felt a sense of calm that made him hesitate. Instead of replying immediately, he put his phone down on the table and let it be. His friend arrived shortly after, a warm smile lighting up her face as she approached the table. "Hey, it's been forever." He stood up to greet her, offering a hug. "I know, too long." They sat down, and the conversation quickly turned to the usual catch-up topics: work, family, and everything in between. But as they talked, the man found himself noticing something. There was no rush, no need to cram everything into a short window of time. They spoke at a comfortable pace, and he felt a sense of connection that was deeper than the typical small talk they used to exchange. At one point, his friend mentioned a recent trip she had taken to the mountains, and the man found himself truly listening. He asked questions. He smiled at the right moments, and he appreciated the way her eyes lit up as she shared her experiences. It was as if he wasn't just hearing her words. He was experiencing her joy and excitement right alongside her. "I used to rush through these kinds of conversations," he admitted after a pause. "I'd be thinking about what I had to do next or how much time we had left, but now, I don't know. I'm just really present in the moment." She smiled, nodding. "That's really great. I've noticed that about you lately. You seem more grounded, you know?" His smile was soft but genuine. "Yeah, I think I've finally figured out that I don't need to be chasing the next thing all the time. It's not about running from one goal to the next. It's about taking it all in, appreciating the moments." Their conversation continued, flowing easily from topic to topic. They laughed about old memories, discussed their current lives, and even shared some of their hopes for the future. It was simple, but it felt real. And for the first time in a long while, the man realized that this was exactly what he had been missing all those years. It wasn't the big milestones or the achievements. It was the quiet, simple moments like this that gave life its true meaning. As they wrapped up their conversation, the man felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. It wasn't just for the time spent with his friend, though that was certainly part of it. It was for the changes he had made in his life. He had come to understand that happiness wasn't a destination. It was a choice, a way of being in the world. Later that evening, as he walked home, he reflected on the day. The sun had set and the streets were quieter than usual. The world felt calm, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe. He had been so wrapped up in the idea of success and the need to prove himself that he had forgotten the simple joy of just being. But now he was reconnecting with that joy piece by piece. When he arrived home, he dropped his bag by the door and sat down at his kitchen table. He stared out the window for a while, lost in thought. It had been a long road, but he had finally come to realize that the person he had been chasing all these years wasn't someone he needed to become. It was someone he already was. He just had to remember that, and he had to be willing to let go of the idea that he had to be anything else. The next morning, he woke up feeling refreshed. There was no rush to get to the office, no need to check his emails first thing. He took a moment to enjoy the quiet of the morning, savoring the simplicity of the moment. As he made his way through his morning routine, he found himself reflecting on the small but meaningful moments that had made the biggest difference in his life. The conversation on the plane with Keanu, the connection with his colleagues, the coffee shop encounter, the heart-to-heart with his friend. Each of these moments had added something valuable to his life. They had reminded him of the importance of being present, of not letting life pass by in a blur of busyness. That afternoon, as he sat in a meeting, he realized that he was no longer anxious about the outcome. He wasn't focused on what others thought of him or on impressing anyone. He was simply engaged in the conversation, listening carefully, offering his thoughts when needed, and trusting that everything would work out as it was meant to. It wasn't about perfection. It was about authenticity. It was about showing up, being real, and embracing the messy, imperfect nature of life. A few weeks later, the man found himself back on a plane, headed to a business conference in another city. As he settled into his seat, he glanced around the cabin and, for a moment, couldn't help but think back to that first flight, the one that had set all of this into motion. He had changed so much since then. He wasn't the same person who had boarded that flight, anxious and consumed by the need to succeed. And yet, as he looked around, he realized something else. He wasn't the only one. Everyone around him was on their own journey, living their own story, facing their own challenges. The thought made him smile. He wasn't alone in this. None of us were. As the plane took off, he sat back in his seat and closed his eyes, not thinking about the next meeting or the tasks waiting for him at his destination. For once, he was just enjoying the ride because, in the end, life wasn't about where you were going. It was about how you got there.